The girl in the snow. The night was bitter, the kind of cold that clawed through even the most expensive wool coats and wrapped itself around bones like an unrelenting ghost. Ethan Cross leaned against the marble column at the entrance of the Westbury Grand, where the annual Children's Future Foundation Gala was underway. Inside, the world's wealthiest mingled over champagne flutes and imported hors d'oeuvres, bidding on auction items they didn't need to impress people they barely knew. Ethan should have been one of them. After all, his name was plastered across half the banners, proudly sponsored by Cross Global Holdings, but he had long since lost the appetite for these events. His black coat hung over his shoulders like armor, tailored to perfection, but as cold as the expression he wore. His jawline was hard, his dark hair carefully swept back, a man sculpted to belong to this world. Yet tonight, he felt like an imposter, a ghost haunting his own success. Ethan, a voice broke through the chilly air. His sister, Lena, appeared at his side, her emerald dress catching the faint glow from the street lamps. Her smile was tight, too rehearsed, like it had been painted on for the press. "You're hiding," she said, her gaze sweeping over him like she was searching for cracks. "I wrote the check," Ethan said, his voice clipped. "Isn't that enough?" Lena shook her head slowly. It never was, not for them. Them, their parents, the ones who believed wealth was meaningless without purpose, who built Cross Global from the ground up with the crazy idea that a business could make money and change lives. But that dream had died with them, buried under boardroom votes and quarterly profit goals. "Spare me the lecture, Lena," Ethan muttered, already turning toward his waiting car, sleek and black against the curb. "You can be the saint tonight." As the Bentley hummed to life, Ethan's fingers drummed on the steering wheel. His reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, cold, controlled, empty. The kind of man who could sign a layoff order over breakfast and finalize a merger over dinner without losing a moment's sleep. The traffic was sluggish, brake lights flaring red across the icy streets. He turned onto Cedar Row, where the glittering storefronts gave way to the forgotten edges of downtown. Snow gathered in uneven piles, sidewalks coated in slush, and steam curled up from the grates like the city itself was exhaling. That's when he saw her, a small figure, huddled in the recess of a boarded-up storefront, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big. Her face was nearly hidden beneath a dirty scarf, but her dark hair spilled over her shoulders like ink against the snow. In her arms, she clutched a teddy bear, battered, one eye missing, its stuffing spilling from a torn seam. Ethan's foot hovered over the gas, but something wouldn't let him drive away. There was nothing remarkable about her, just another homeless kid, another story the world had already decided not to care about. Yet something about her stilled the air inside his car. His chest tightened, a dull ache looming from somewhere deep and forgotten. Before he knew what he was doing, Ethan pulled to the curb and stepped out into the cold. The girl flinched as his shadow fell across her. "Are you hungry?" Ethan asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I can get you something warm." She lifted her face slowly, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes, wide, dark, and far too familiar. They were the same shape, the same depth as the ones that stared back at him from his childhood photos. Her lips trembled as she stared at him, and in a voice so small it might have been a snowflake, she whispered, "Daddy." Ethan froze. The word shattered the world he knew. His pulse thundered in his ears. The girl's face crumpled, her fingers clutching the teddy bear so tightly the fabric strained. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling with shame. You look like him." Ethan knelt down slowly, the snow soaking through the knee of his $1,000 trousers. "It's okay," he said softly. "What's your name?" "Ellie," she said, her voice no louder than the snowflakes drifting around them. "Ellie," Ethan repeated, the name curling strangely on his tongue, familiar and foreign all at once. "Where's your father?" Her face darkened, her chin dipping toward her chest. He died." The word hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. I'm sorry. Ellie didn't look up. Mom said he worked at a fancy company, fixing things, but after he lost his job, he got really sad. Her fingers traced absent patterns along the teddy bear's worn fur. Then one night, his car went off the road. Ethan's throat tightened. A sick, creeping sense of recognition curled in his stomach. What about your mom? Ellie's lips wobbled. She got sick too. But in her mind, she talks to people who aren't there. They took her away, to a hospital. They said they'd find someone to take care of me. But nobody came. The world around them blurred. The snow, the cold, the distant traffic. It all faded into silence. Ethan removed his coat without thinking, wrapping it around Ellie's thin shoulders. It swallowed her whole. You shouldn't be out here, Ethan said gently. There are places you can go, places that can help. She shook her head fiercely, her small hands clinging to the coat's sleeves. No, they'll take me away, and then Mommy won't know where to find me. Ethan's heart twisted painfully. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, he said. Let's get you somewhere warm, somewhere safe. You can even bring your bear. Ellie hesitated, her wide eyes searching his face, reading something in him Ethan couldn't even see himself. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. She climbed into the Bentley, the plush leather seats far too grand for a child whose hands were chapped and raw from the cold. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and her teddy bear sat in her lap like a fragile shield. Ethan pulled away from the curb, but his mind was nowhere on the road ahead. A long-buried memory was clawing its way to the surface. A letter, a plea, a termination order with his own signature at the bottom. What if? No, it couldn't be. But as Ellie's small voice filled the silence, asking simple questions about the heated seats and the sparkling city lights, Ethan's heart beat harder against the walls he had built so carefully. Somewhere between the past and the present, between profit and conscience, between the man he was and the man he used to be, Ethan Cross was about to learn what it meant to be truly rich. The ghosts in the penthouse. The Bentley's tires hummed softly against the pavement, the sound muffled by the storm of thoughts inside Ethan Cross's head. His eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, where Ellie sat curled up in the oversized coat that swallowed her tiny frame. Her eyes were wide, darting around the sleek leather interior, as though afraid she might accidentally touch something too valuable. She sat perfectly still, her battered teddy bear cradled in her lap like a fragile heart. Every time the car hit a bump, her hands clutched it tighter. Is this your car? Her voice, quiet as snowfall, broke the silence. It is, Ethan answered, surprised by how hoarse his voice sounded. Do you like it? She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of a heated seat control. It's really clean, she said, the kind of comment only a child who'd spent months living in filth would notice. The world outside the windows blurred, steel towers glowing against the night, neon flickering in puddles on cracked sidewalks. Ethan had passed these streets countless times, rarely seeing anything but potential investment opportunities. Tonight, the city felt like a living thing, breathing, watching, whispering. He pulled into the underground garage of Cross Tower, the luxury skyscraper where his penthouse consumed the top 2 floors. As the elevator whisked them up, Ellie's wide eyes took in everything. The gold-trimmed mirrors, the marble floor, the keypad instead of buttons. You live all the way at the top, she asked. Yes. Do you ever get scared up there? Ethan blinked. Scared of what? She shrugged, pulling her knees to her chest. Falling. The doors opened into a world that might as well have been another planet. Towering glass walls, marble floors gleaming beneath the soft glow of recessed lights, furniture arranged so perfectly it looked untouched. It wasn't a home, it was a showroom. Ellie took a cautious step inside, her shoes leaving damp prints on the polished floor. She flinched when the automatic blinds slid open with a whisper, revealing the glittering skyline below. Her teddy bear's head peeked from the oversized coat, as though he too was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it all. "Is this a hotel?" she asked. "No," Ethan said quietly. "This is my home." Ellie frowned slightly. "It's too quiet to be a home." The words hit Ethan harder than they should have. He cleared his throat. "You're safe here. I'll get you something to eat." She didn't move further inside, standing stiffly near the door, half expecting someone to yell at her for dirtying the floor. The contrast was too much. A child from the streets standing in the middle of a billionaire's palace, a walking crack in the foundation of his perfectly curated life. In the kitchen, Ethan rummaged through sleek cabinets, unused to the task of feeding anyone, especially a child. His housekeeper stocked the fridge with gourmet cheeses and imported fruits, none of which seemed appropriate. Finally, he found a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and some milk. Basic, but familiar. He placed the sandwich and glass on the oversized kitchen island. Ellie approached like she was crossing into forbidden territory. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the sandwich, biting into it slowly, carefully, as though each bite needed to be savored because it might be her last. "You don't have to eat so fast," Ethan said softly. She didn't answer, but the speed of her chewing slowed just a little. "Where did you sleep before tonight?" Ethan asked. She glanced up, her face unreadable. "Sometimes shelters, sometimes the library, if I could hide before they locked up. One time, there was a nice lady who let me sleep in the back of her laundry shop, but then someone told on her, and she got in trouble." The matter-of-fact way she said it made Ethan's chest ache. She wasn't telling him a sad story. She was just telling him her life. He leaned on the counter, trying to summon the right words. "Would it be okay if you stayed here for a while?" Ellie froze, her fingers tightening around the edge of the sandwich. "Like, forever?" "Not forever," Ethan said carefully. "But until we figure out what's best. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you're not alone." Her eyes darted toward the door, and Ethan could practically see the invisible checklist in her mind. How much can I trust him? How soon should I run if I'm wrong? "Do you have kids?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. "No." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Why not?" Ethan forced a smile. "I was busy." "With what?" "Work." Her face twisted in confusion. Work instead of having a family. It was such a simple question. And such a damning one. Ethan cleared his throat. "Would you like to see where you can sleep tonight?" Ellie followed him down the hall, her small footsteps nearly silent against the imported wood floors. Ethan opened the door to a guest room, one of 3, with a king-sized bed, pristine white sheets, and a view of the entire city. Ellie stopped in the doorway, her arms tightening around the teddy bear. "I can't sleep here." "Why not?" "It's too big." Ethan frowned. "You can sleep wherever you want." She pointed to the oversized armchair near the window, a soft, plush monstrosity that looked like it had never been sat in. "I'll sleep there," she said firmly. Ethan started to argue, but something in her face stopped him. This wasn't a child being difficult. This was a child terrified of too much comfort, because comfort never lasted. "All right," Ethan said quietly. "Let me get you some blankets." As he draped a heavy cashmere throw over the chair, he noticed Ellie inspecting the window. "You're not gonna lock me in here, right?" she asked. "No," Ethan said softly. "You're not a prisoner." "Good." She placed the teddy bear on the chair like a sentry. "Because I have to see the stars." Ethan left her there, staring out at the sky, her breath fogging the glass. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of his own too-large bed, his hands clasped between his knees. The questions were already circling like vultures. Who was her father? What company did he work for? A memory tugged at him, a stack of papers on his desk, his signature scrawled across them without thought. Layoffs, cost-cutting initiatives, departments dismantled, families left behind. Ethan grabbed his phone, his fingers hesitating over the name of his assistant, Malcolm Shaw. Malcolm had been with him for years, long enough to know where all the bodies were buried. He dialed. "Mr. Cross, Malcolm's voice was crisp despite the late hour. "Everything all right? I need you to pull the employee termination records from 3 years ago," Ethan said, "specifically from maintenance and facilities." "Maintenance?" Malcolm sounded puzzled. "Sir, those were some of the earliest cuts." "Just do it," Ethan said tightly. "And Malcolm, don't ask why." "Understood." He hung up and stood by the window, his own breath fogging the glass beside Ellie's. Somewhere in the vast sprawl of Cross Global Holdings was the truth, a truth Ethan had spent years avoiding. But now it was curled up in his guest room, holding a teddy bear with one eye and calling him Daddy. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cross didn't know if he was about to lose everything, or finally find something worth saving. Shattered reflections. Ethan Cross didn't sleep. The walls of his penthouse were built to silence the world outside. No street noise, no hum of traffic, no human presence other than his own. That silence had always been a comfort, a shield. Tonight, it was unbearable. He stood in his office, illuminated only by the city lights pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and stared at his laptop screen. His assistant, Malcolm Shaw, had done exactly as instructed. A folder labeled Cross Global, Terminated Staff. Facilities Division sat open, filled with scanned records from 3 years prior. There were 206 names. Most of them meant nothing to him, just entries on spreadsheets, statistics that had shaved enough off the budget to please shareholders. But one name stood out. Miller Eric J., Facilities Maintenance Technician. Terminated August 17, 20XX. Ethan's mouth felt dry. His cursor hovered over the file, his finger frozen above the mouse button. He clicked. A scanned image of Eric Miller's personnel file filled the screen. The photo was grainy. A man in his mid-30s, dark hair, kind smile, wearing a blue maintenance uniform. In the corner of the image, barely visible, was a familiar detail. A small girl, no more than 5, peeking into the frame, clutching a one-eyed teddy bear. The same bear Ellie had clutched when Ethan found her. Ethan sank into his leather chair, the weight of realization pressing him down like a lid blanket. This wasn't coincidence. This was consequence. He fired her father. His own signature was there, elegant and emotionless, approving the mass layoff, the justification a neat little paragraph about operational efficiency. The same hands that signed the paperwork had tucked Ellie into a blanket tonight. His stomach turned. He scrolled further. Attached to Eric Miller's file was something unexpected. A scanned copy of a handwritten letter. The edges of the paper were slightly torn, the ink smudged in places. It was addressed to Ethan Cross, CEO. Dear Mr. Cross, I know you don't know me personally, but I've worked at Cross Global for over 8 years. I'm not writing to beg, only to ask for a little time. My wife has been sick for months, and without my job, we'll lose her insurance. We have a daughter, Ellie. She's only 5. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance. I love my job. I'm good at it. Please, sir, I'm just trying to keep my family together. Sincerely, Eric Miller. Ethan's stomach twisted so violently he had to brace himself against the desk. He had never seen this letter before, or if he had, it had been buried under a mountain of contracts and reports, discarded like countless other desperate pleas from employees who became collateral damage. He closed his laptop and sat in the dark, staring at his own reflection in the window. A man in a tailored suit, living at the top of the world, looking down at the lives he had crushed to get there. In the silence, he heard a soft sound. He turned toward the hallway. Ellie stood there, barefoot, her oversized borrowed pajamas hanging off her too thin frame. Her hair was a tangled mess, her teddy bear dangling from one hand. Can't sleep? Ethan asked, his voice softer than usual. Ellie shook her head. Too quiet. Ethan stood, crossing the room to her. Want me to show you something? She hesitated, then gave a small nod. He led her to a door at the far end of the penthouse. A door even he hadn't opened in years. Inside was a room far smaller than any guest suite. Not much more than a nook, really. But there was something different about it. A window seat, piled high with pillows and blankets. The kind of spot a child might curl up in to watch the world. His mother had designed it years ago, back when Ethan was just a boy. It was meant to be a retreat, a soft space in a hard world. Ellie's eyes lit up. "This is for me," she asked. "If you want it," Ethan said. She climbed onto the cushions, burrowing into them like a squirrel into leaves. Through the window, the city glowed below them, endless, alive, and just a little less terrifying from up here. Ethan lingered in the doorway, watching her. The soft glow of the city lights caught in her dark hair, and for a moment, she looked almost at peace. "Did you know my dad?" she asked suddenly. Ethan's throat tightened. I don't know. Maybe." Ellie traced the worn fur of her teddy bear. "He said people at his job were really important, that they built stuff that made life better for everyone." Ethan swallowed hard. "Your dad sounds like a good man." "He was," Ellie said firmly. "Even when we didn't have enough money for new shoes, he always found a way to get me a birthday cake. Every year, even after he lost his job." Ethan's chest ached. "That's what good dads do." Ellie yawned, her eyelids drooping. "Do you think, if he saw me now, he'd still be proud of me?" Ethan sat on the floor beside her makeshift bed. "I think," he said quietly, "he'd be the proudest dad in the whole world." Ellie's breathing slowed, her small body relaxing into the nest of pillows. Ethan sat there long after she fell asleep, staring at her fragile form, his mind racing. "This is your fault." The voice inside him was cold and relentless. If he'd read that letter, if he'd reconsidered, if he'd seen Eric Miller as a father, not a line item. His phone vibrated against the floor beside him. A text from Malcolm. "Pulled the full termination report for facilities. 90% had families. Want me to send the full analysis?" Ethan stared at the screen. No, not yet. He couldn't bear it. Not now. Instead, he pulled the cashmere throw over Ellie's small frame and sat silently, watching her breathe. Somewhere in the vast machinery of Cross Global, the echoes of past decisions were waking up. And Ethan Cross, the man who had spent a lifetime insulating himself from consequences, was starting to feel every one of them. And for the first time in years, the silence in his penthouse was broken by the sound of a child's breathing. The sound of someone trusting him to keep them safe. Ethan wasn't sure if he was worthy of it. But for Ellie and for the father she had lost, he would try. The weight of her name. The sun rose slowly over the city, sending pale winter light filtering through the glass walls of the penthouse. Ethan Cross stood at the coffee maker, watching the machine drip dark liquid into his cup. The aroma filled the kitchen, but he didn't taste the first sip. His mind was too full of the ghosts from last night. The file, the letter, and the little girl asleep in the window seat. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her father's name, Eric Miller, burning behind his eyelids. Ethan had spent a lifetime mastering control. Boardrooms, hostile takeovers, press conferences. There was no storm he couldn't weather, no crisis he couldn't spin into an opportunity. But this wasn't a spreadsheet or a lawsuit. This was a child, flesh and blood, and a weight that had been 3 years in the making. A small sound broke his spiral. Soft footsteps, hesitant against the cold floor. He turned to find Ellie standing in the kitchen doorway, barefoot, her hair wild from sleep, the cuffs of her 2 big pajama pants dragging on the marble. Her teddy bear hung from one hand, its fur catching the morning light like threadbare gold. Ethan tried to smile. "Morning." Ellie yawned, showing tiny teeth. "Is it still okay for me to be here?" The question hit him square in the chest. "Of course it's okay," he said, softer than he'd meant. "I was going to make breakfast. Do you like pancakes?" Her face lit up with a cautious sort of excitement, the kind born from too many disappointments. You know how to make pancakes." He didn't, but there were instructions on the back of the box, and that was good enough for now. As he fumbled through the unfamiliar steps, mixing batter, heating the griddle, Ellie climbed onto one of the kitchen stools, her feet swinging just above the floor. She rested her chin on the countertop, watching him with the solemn curiosity of someone unsure whether this was real life or a dream she was afraid to wake from. "Did you sleep okay?" Ethan asked, trying to fill the silence. Ellie nodded. "The stars looked different up here." "How so?" "There, farther." She traced an invisible shape on the counter. "At the shelter, I could see the stars right above me, like they were closer when I was outside. But up here, they feel like they're hiding." Ethan flipped a pancake, the batter sizzling. "Maybe they're just waiting to come closer." "Maybe." Ellie shrugged, her thin shoulders rising under the borrowed pajama top. "Do you think my mom can see the stars from where she is?" Ethan's grip tightened on the spatula. "Where is your mom?" Ellie fidgeted with her teddy bear's ear. "The hospital. The big one with the green roof. They took her there after she got sick in her head." He set down the spatula. "Do you know what it's called?" She squinted, thinking hard. "Street Helena Psychiatric Center," she said, each syllable pronounced carefully like a spell she had memorized to keep her mother close. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew Street Helena. It was underfunded, overcrowded, and the subject of several quietly settled lawsuits over patient neglect. The idea of Ellie's mother, Eric Miller's wife, being treated there made his skin crawl. "We can visit her," Ethan said before he could think better of it. Ellie's head shot up, eyes wide. "We can. If you want." "Yes." She was practically vibrating with excitement. Then, just as quickly, her face darkened with worry. "But what if she doesn't remember me?" Ethan knelt beside her stool, meeting her at eye level. "She'll remember you," he said firmly. "You're unforgettable." Ellie's smile was shy but real. For the first time since he found her, it reached her eyes. Later that day, the Bentley moved through a very different part of the city than the one Ethan usually frequented. The towers of glass and steel gave way to cracked sidewalks and crumbling brick facades. Street Helena loomed at the end of the block, its paint peeling, windows barred on the upper floors like a prison for ghosts no one wanted to see. Ethan parked, but Ellie didn't move. Her small hands twisted the bear's paw over and over, her breath quickening. "What if she's mad at me?" she whispered. "She won't be mad," Ethan said softly. "She's your mom." Ellie nodded, but her grip on the bear only tightened. They entered the lobby, fluorescent lights buzzing, the air heavy with disinfectant. The receptionist barely glanced up, more interested in her phone than the man in a tailored coat and the little girl clutching a bear missing an eye. "We're here to visit Claire Miller," Ethan said, his tone cutting through the indifference like a blade. The receptionist's fingers tapped her keyboard. "Patient in long-term care unit. Visits are supervised." "That's fine. Are you the guardian?" Ethan hesitated. "I'm a friend." The woman didn't care enough to press. She handed him a visitor badge and buzzed them through the locked door. The hallways were dim, the walls a lifeless beige, the air cold in a way that settled in the bones. Ellie's steps slowed with each door they passed, until she stopped entirely outside room 217. "Do you want me to go in first?" Ethan asked. Ellie shook her head, her small fingers curling around his. Inside, Claire Miller sat by the window, her thin frame draped in a hospital-issued robe. Her hair was stringy, her hands pale and restless in her lap, her eyes unfocused as they tracked something invisible beyond the glass. "Mom," Ellie's voice cracked. Claire blinked slowly, her gaze drifting toward the sound. For a moment, there was nothing, just a vacant stare, empty recognition. Then something flickered. "Ellie?" Claire's voice was a whisper, rough from disuse. Ellie ran to her, flinging her arms around her mother's thin frame. "It's me, Mommy. It's me." Claire's hands trembled as they lifted, settling on Ellie's back like they were afraid to break her. Her fingers tangled in Ellie's hair, her breathing hitching in uneven sobs. "My baby," she whispered. "My baby girl." Ethan stood back, feeling like an intruder in a moment too fragile to touch. His throat ached, but he forced himself to stay quiet, letting the two cling to each other like shipwreck survivors finally finding a piece of solid ground. After a long while, Claire looked up, and for the first time, her eyes met Ethan's. Recognition flickered. "Ethan. Cross," she whispered, her voice trembling with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it either. Ethan's heart stopped. Claire knew him. She knew exactly who he was. The man who signed the order. The man who destroyed her husband. The man now standing in her daughter's life. A past that breathes. For a moment, the only sound in room 217 was the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. A drip from an IV bag tapped the silence, slow and methodical, counting down the seconds as Ethan Cross stood frozen beneath the weight of Claire Miller's gaze. The eyes of a woman who had once trusted her husband to a job Ethan destroyed. The eyes of a woman who knew, even in her haze of medication and trauma, exactly who he was. "You?" Claire's voice cracked. Her arms remained tight around Ellie. Her fingers curled protectively into the fabric of the little girl's borrowed coat. "You're him." Ethan's throat felt lined with glass. "Mrs. Miller." "Don't." Claire's voice sharpened, a brittle edge cutting through the room's sterile air. Her entire body tensed, years of anger and fear waking up at once. "You're the reason." Ellie's small face tilted up, confusion clouding her wide eyes. "Mommy, what do you mean?" "Mr. Cross saved me." Claire's arms shook around her daughter. "No, baby," she whispered, her gaze never leaving Ethan's face. "He's the reason we needed saving." Ethan felt the weight of Ellie's stare shift to him, her small fingers clinging to her mother with the confusion of a child trying to hold onto two worlds at once. The man who gave her shelter and the mother who held her now. The man who saved her, and the man who might have destroyed her life before it even began. "I didn't know," Ethan said quietly, his voice frayed at the edges. "Not then. You didn't care." Claire spat, her exhaustion and fury sharpening into something that cut straight through Ethan's carefully composed exterior. "My husband gave everything to your company. His nights, his weekends, his heart. And you signed him away like he was nothing." "Mom." Ellie's voice trembled, her confusion turning to fear. "What are you talking about?" Claire's face softened only for Ellie, her fingers gently smoothing the girl's tangled hair. "Your daddy worked for Mr. Cross's company. Sweetheart, remember how proud he was, how he used to wear his uniform even when he wasn't working because he said it made him feel like part of something important." Ellie nodded, but her brow wrinkled, her mind trying to connect the dots. "Mr. Cross decided your daddy's job didn't matter anymore," Claire said softly, her voice not cruel, just heartbreakingly factual. "And after that, everything fell apart." Ellie turned toward Ethan, her face pale and round with innocent disbelief. "Is that true?" Ethan could have lied. He could have softened it, spun it, wrapped it in excuses like he had done for so many board members and reporters over the years. But not to her. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice low but clear. "It's true." Ellie's fingers tightened around her teddy bear, pulling it to her chest like a shield. But you found me. You helped me." Ethan took a slow, deliberate breath. "I didn't know who you were when I found you. But when I did, I knew I had to help." "Why?" Ellie's voice was small. "Because I made a mistake," Ethan said. "One I can't undo, but I can try to make things better." Claire's breath was ragged, her hand still trembling on Ellie's back. "You think you can just buy your way out of this?" "No," Ethan said, his voice almost breaking. "That's the thing. Money doesn't fix this. It doesn't bring Eric back. It doesn't erase what you lost. But I can't turn away from Ellie. Not now." Claire stared at him for a long time, the hatred that had burned in her eyes slowly tempered by something far more painful: grief, exhaustion, the weight of too many battles fought and lost. "She's my daughter," Claire said, her voice shaking. "She's your daughter," Ethan agreed quietly. "And I'm not trying to take her from you." Ellie's eyes darted between them. Her small shoulders curled inward like she was bracing herself for the next blow. "Can we go home now, Mommy?" Claire's breath hitched. "Home," she whispered, the word so fragile it almost dissolved in the air. "She can come with me," Ethan said softly. "Just for a little while. Until you're ready." Claire's gaze darted to Ellie, the clean pajamas, the brushed hair, the way her face was a little fuller after 2 real meals. A child no longer living on street corners, no longer shivering in doorways. Safe. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. "I can't take care of her yet." "You will," Ethan said. "When you're ready. Until then, you both have a place." Claire exhaled, a long shuddering breath, and her shoulders slumped. She kissed Ellie's hair, the tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Okay," she whispered. Ellie's arms wrapped around her mother tighter, the kind of hug that felt like it could hold 2 broken pieces of a life together. "We'll come visit," Ethan said. "Every day if you want." Claire looked at him again, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but something close to acceptance. "You don't get to disappear this time." "I know," Ethan said. Ellie pressed a kiss to her mother's cheek, then slid off the hospital bed, taking Ethan's hand without hesitation. "Come back soon." "Okay," Ellie whispered. Claire's smile was small and trembling. "I promise." As they left the room, Ellie's fingers stayed wrapped in Ethan's, smaller, but so much stronger than they should have been. They walked in silence down the cold hallway, past the locked doors and flickering fluorescent lights, toward the life Ethan was only just beginning to understand. In the car, Ellie broke the silence. "Are you really the reason Daddy lost his job?" "Yes," Ethan said, no hesitation. "Do you think he'd hate you?" Ethan's hands clenched the steering wheel. "I think he'd want me to do better." Ellie was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A worn photograph, edges curled and frayed. It was a picture of Eric Miller, grinning with Ellie on his shoulders, a birthday cake in the background, and the faint outline of Cross Global's logo on his uniform sleeve. "Mom gave me this when they took her to the hospital," Ellie said. "She said to keep it safe because it was proof we were happy once." Ethan's throat burned. "He looks like a good man." "He was," Ellie said, then glanced up at him with those dark, too knowing eyes. "But you're helping me now. So I think he'd want me to give you a chance." Ethan couldn't speak. The traffic lights turned green, but Ethan stayed still for a long moment, hands gripping the wheel, heart pounding under the weight of everything this little girl had just handed him. Not just a photograph, but a sliver of hope. A chance. And Ethan Cross, who had always believed chances were things you bought or took, was starting to realize they were sometimes gifts you had to earn. With Ellie beside him, and the ghosts of Eric Miller and Claire Miller in his rearview mirror, Ethan pressed the gas and drove toward whatever came next. A different legacy. The days that followed felt strangely weightless, like Ethan Cross had stepped into a life that didn't quite fit him. The suit still hung in his wardrobe, the emails still filled his inbox, and his name still echoed in the financial press. But none of it seemed as real as the sound of Ellie's bare feet padding across the marble floors of his penthouse. She filled the silent rooms with her voice, narrating everything she did, brushing Theodore the teddy bear's fur with a toothbrush she found, counting the buttons on the throw pillows, standing on her toes to peer over the edge of his vast desk. "Do you really need a desk this big?" she asked one morning, tracing a finger across its polished surface. "It's like a table for giants." Ethan set aside the document he wasn't really reading. Maybe I thought the size would make me look more important. Does it? She asked, so matter-of-factly it made him laugh. Not anymore. It was strange, the way she had wormed her way into his world. Not like an intruder, but like something the place had always been missing, only no one noticed until she was there. Her drawings were taped to his spotless refrigerator, bursts of color against the sterile steel. Her shoes, small and scuffed, rested beside his polished dress shoes at the entryway. Her bear, one-eyed and lopsided, occupied the seat beside him at breakfast like an honored guest. One evening, after Ellie had fallen asleep curled in the window seat, Ethan stood in the kitchen, pouring a drink he wouldn't touch, while Lena stood across from him. His sister had come by twice since hearing rumors, whispered through corporate channels, that Ethan Cross, king of cold efficiency, had taken in a street child. "She calls me Mr. Cross," Ethan said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "like I'm the principal or a landlord." Lena arched a brow. "What do you want her to call you?" "I don't know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not her father." "No." Lena's voice softened. "But you might be the closest thing she's got right now." Ethan's jaw tensed. "I don't deserve that." Lena's heels clicked softly against the tile as she stepped closer. "Deserve doesn't matter, Ethan. What matters is showing up." He didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to. The first visit. The next day, Ethan and Ellie returned to Street Helena Psychiatric Center, bearing a backpack filled with things Ellie had picked out for her mom. A soft scarf, some scented lotion, a new sketchpad, and a pack of colored pencils. Claire Miller sat propped up in bed, her hair brushed and her eyes clearer than they had been before. The medication adjustments were helping, the doctor said. So was Ellie. "Hi, Mommy," Ellie beamed, climbing onto the bed without hesitation. Claire's smile was soft, still tentative, like she didn't quite trust it yet. "Hi, sweetheart." Ethan stayed in the doorway, giving them space, but Claire's eyes drifted to him, and something shifted in her expression. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was no longer just blame. It was the reluctant understanding that the man who broke their family might also be the only one willing to put the pieces back together. "You're still here," Claire said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I will be." She exhaled, her fingers brushing Ellie's hair. "I hated you." "I know. But Ellie says you make her pancakes." Her gaze softened slightly. "That's more than I expected from you." Ethan's throat tightened. "It's the least I can do." "You can do more." Claire's voice was stronger now. "Help her see a future that isn't just surviving." Ethan nodded, the weight of that responsibility settling in his chest like something solid. "I will." The letter. Late that night, long after Ellie had fallen asleep in her nest of pillows, Ethan sat in his office. The city stretched out below him. In front of him lay Eric Miller's letter, the one that had been buried in HR archives, ignored until it was too late. He read it again. Every word, every desperate line, every plea that had been swallowed by a system designed to erase humanity from business. Ethan pulled a sheet of his own stationery from the drawer, pen in hand, and for the first time in years, he wrote by hand. "Dear Eric, I don't know if anyone ever answered your letter. I know I didn't. I signed a piece of paper, and your life, your family, became collateral damage in a system I thought was just business. I've been learning, painfully and slowly, that business isn't just numbers. It's people. It's your daughter drawing pictures in my kitchen. It's your wife fighting to hold onto herself in a place that's too cold for healing. It's a bear missing an eye and a little girl who holds it like a lifeline. I can't give you back your job, your life, or your future, but I can protect your daughter. I can make sure she knows how much you loved her. And I can make sure the world she grows up in remembers your name. I'm sorry, Eric. I'm sorry for every unchecked box and unread letter. But most of all, I'm sorry it took losing you to remember who I was supposed to be. I won't fail her. Not again. Ethan Cross." He folded the letter and slipped it into the same folder where Eric's plea had sat, unnoticed and unanswered. It wouldn't bring Eric back, but it would sit there, proof that Ethan Cross was finally listening. The Foundation. 2 weeks later, Lena stood beside Ethan as the Cross Foundation officially announced the Miller Initiative, a program dedicated to supporting employees during personal crisis, ensuring that no one else would fall through the cracks Eric Miller had. The press was divided. Some called it a PR stunt. Others praised it as a necessary step. Ethan didn't care. It wasn't for them. The first framed photograph placed in the Foundation's new hall was a black and white picture of Eric Miller in his maintenance uniform, smiling with Ellie on his shoulders. Below it, a plaque. In memory of Eric Miller, a good man, a loving father, a life that mattered. A new name. That night, Ethan tucked Ellie into the window seat, her teddy bear freshly stitched where Maggie, Ethan's housekeeper, had carefully mended its missing eye. Ellie lay under the Kashmir throw, her tiny fingers tracing the stars through the glass. "Good night, Mr. Cross," she said sleepily. Ethan hesitated, then knelt beside her. "You know, you could call me something else if you want." Ellie's brow furrowed. "Like what?" "I don't know," Ethan said softly. "Whatever feels right." She thought for a long moment, her small fingers twirling a strand of her hair. "Could I call you Ethan?" she asked. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. "Of course." Ellie yawned, curling deeper into her blanket. "Or maybe." Her voice trailed off into sleep. The word never fully formed. Ethan sat beside her until her breathing slowed, steady and safe. He didn't know if he would ever deserve a word like Dad. But tonight, Ethan was enough. Tomorrow, they'd visit Claire. Tomorrow, they'd paint more pictures. Tomorrow, there would be more mistakes to face and more work to do. But tonight, there was just a little girl, a window seat, and a sky full of stars, closer than they'd ever been before.